All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Whitehead Reading Group, where we are looking at some seldom or never seen articles, addresses, and writings from Whitehead from the archive. This is our last meeting of this experiment, and we're so glad to have you all with us. I'm Brianne Donaldson, and I teach philosophy and religious studies at the University of California, Irvine. And I'm so glad to be joined by my co-vectors, Joe Petek, who is the chief archivist, and Brian Henning of Gonzaga University. As many of you know, when I proposed this idea to Brian and Joe, we thought we might have maybe a dozen people, and we had over about 180 people from several countries sign up and register to join the meetings or to watch the videos. And of course, it's so good to have all of you here with us today. This will be our last session for the time being, and I'll turn it over to Brian now, who can give a few announcements.
Hello, everyone. Good morning or good day, depending on where you find yourself. I'm glad you're here with us. Again, my name is Brian Henning. I'm a professor of philosophy at Gonzaga University in Washington State and the executive editor of the critical edition of Whitehead. This has been a really fun treat to be with you all. I wanted to start off with a reminder that we have a call for papers out for a conference on the second volume of the critical edition. That conference will be virtual and free of charge. It'll be held on the 16th and 17th of September of 2022. So a year from this September. If you go to whiteheadresearch.org and go to occasions, you can find the website. I'm mentioning it now again because it would be a really good idea, if you haven't already, to get a copy of the second volume of the lectures and make your way through it this summer so that you can get a proposal in, because it'll take quite a bit of lead time. But the idea is to start engaging with these new materials in the hopes of expanding the research that we've all been doing on Whitehead's work to find out what the significance possibly is of these new materials. Other than that, I don't think I have any particular other announcements. I'll turn it over to Joe.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe. You want to get us into today's article?
Yeah, why not? So again, my name is Joe Petek, and I'm the Whitehead Research Project's chief archivist and assistant editor for the critical edition of Whitehead. And as before, I'll be giving a little bit of background on the reading we're discussing today. We don't know the exact occasion or the date of this address, unfortunately, but we do know a few things about it. First, the year was 1923. I'll say more in a moment about why we know it was 1923. But as for the occasion, these lines from the second paragraph of page 16 are revealing. He says, quote, "Now I think all this has a very special message to us who belong to the Labor Party. The day is not very distant when our party will be in power, and when that day comes, we intend to put our principles to the acid test of practice." From these two lines and other mentions of the Labor Party in the second half of the document, it seems apparent that Whitehead was speaking at a Labor Party gathering of some kind. This is not at all surprising, for he had often spoken on behalf of candidates of the Liberal Party decades earlier in Grantchester. But the Liberal Party had waned in influence in the early 1920s, with the Labor Party becoming the main opposition. And so it seems that as of 1923, he had begun supporting Labor. But I haven't found any other evidence that would allow us to be more specific about the occasion of which Whitehead was delivering this address. Back to the date. One of the biggest reasons why this particular essay is interesting is that Whitehead wrote and delivered it in 1923 in the brief period between his first visit to America in April 1922 and actually emigrating there in the fall of 1924. We know this because Whitehead wrote on the first page that, quote, "I stayed in America for the first time last year." And until a couple years ago, I hadn't even been aware that Whitehead had visited the US at all before moving there. And I suspect it's not terribly well known among Whitehead scholars either, but he did. Again, it was April of 1922, and Victor Lowe discusses the trip fairly briefly in the second volume of his Whitehead biography, so I'll go ahead and just read what he has on it. Quote, They had never been to America. The occasion was a festival to honor Charlotte Angus Scott on her retirement as professor of mathematics at Bryn Mawr College. She was English, had been at Bryn Mawr since 1885, and had published some mathematical books and papers. She had studied at Girton, where the day in 1880 when Cambridge announced that she had made a score in the mathematical tripos equal to that of the 8th Wrangler was celebrated. As Cambridge did not give degrees to women, her BSc and DSc were from the University of London. Whitehead conveyed the greetings of Girton's staff and read a paper, Some Principles of Physical Science, dedicated to Miss Scott. It was reprinted as Chapter 4 of his Principle of Relativity. The Whiteheads returned to London as soon as the festival ended, but they had fallen in love with America. Lowe mentions Girton as the college that Scott had attended. This was a women's college at which Whitehead taught for about 25 years, in parallel with his teaching duties at Trinity. Apparently, most of the Cambridge dons lecturing there did so gratis, and so it seems likely that Whitehead did so as well. It's nice to be able to know that on the issue of women's rights and equality, Whitehead was squarely on the right side of history. He was for degrees for women at Cambridge in 1896 when students were against it by almost 4-1, and also had a 1906 speech of his delivered at the Cambridge Women's Suffrage Association printed and distributed as a pamphlet. Process Studies published that years back. Then there's Bryn Mawr. An interesting connection here is with Theodore and Grace de Laguna, a married couple who were both professors of philosophy there. Theodore had reviewed Whitehead's PNK in 1920, but it's unclear to me whether they had met in person prior to his 1922 trip. Quite possibly they hadn't. What does seem clear is that the Whiteheads likely got to know the de Lagunas somewhat during the trip, as evidenced by 2 letters we have between Whitehead and Grace in our archive. Also, Theodore wrote an article in August 1922, about 3 or 4 months later, suggesting a way to reform Whitehead's method of extensive abstraction, and Whitehead would later credit him with making possible the treatment of extension found in process and reality. Now, moving briefly into the actual manuscript itself that we're looking at, Whitehead talks on the first page of unexpectedly having an American friend there with him, and writes on the left margin that Phil Johnson came with us. At first, I despaired of ever discovering who this was because it's such a terribly generic name. But upon reviewing some of Whitehead's letters, I found that Whitehead mentioned a Phil Johnson a number of times, and at one point said that he was going home to Cleveland, Ohio. So armed with this information, I did a search and came up with Philip Cortelyou Johnson, a famous architect who was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. At first, I thought this must be mistaken, since Johnson was born in 1906, which would mean he was 16 at the time of this address. But on a second look, it appears to be correct. For one, Johnson studied philosophy at Harvard, and Whitehead's grading notebook lists his name for his fall 1927 Philosophy 3B lecture course. For another, biographies of Johnson reveal that he interrupted his Harvard education several times for extended trips to Europe, for he was the son of very wealthy parents and could afford to do so. It's not clear to me how he first met the Whiteheads, but it's evident that they stayed in touch. But Johnson's image has suffered recently due to his anti-Semitism and Nazi sympathies. Harvard stripped his name off one of his buildings just last year. But anyway, in the middle of the address, Whitehead spends a fair amount of time comparing England's National Physical Laboratory, or NPL, and the United States National Bureau of Standards, which would be renamed as the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, in 1988. Both agencies were founded at nearly the same time, the NPL in 1899 and the Bureau of Standards in 1901, but Whitehead describes the latter as having far more resources available. In 1923, it had about 900 employees spread across 14 buildings, though the staff salaries were apparently still much lower than in private industry. But funnily enough, in this case, the American agency had a much more socialistic way of working than England's at the time, with the results of experiments being published and available to all rather than owned by commissioning private citizens. This was, of course, prior to the Great Depression of the 1930s, and in another irony, none other than Herbert Hoover helped to build up the Bureau of Standards while he was Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge in the 1920s. And I'll end by talking a little bit about the British elections around this time, since this is an essay in which Whitehead is clearly laying out a political and economic vision at a time of serious flux in the British political landscape, with the decline of the Liberal Party and the rise of the Labour Party, not to mention the post-World War I reality, along with new voting rights laws. But as I really know very little about the politics of Britain 100 years ago, I can really only provide some numbers and some very broad strokes. The Conservative Party suffered a major loss in the December 1923 general election, losing their parliamentary majority, leading to the first ever Labour government consisting of the combined Labour and Liberal parties. The Labour Party was so new to the game that their cabinet held only 3 members who had previously been ministers. One of these was Whitehead's friend, Lord Haldane, himself previously a Liberal. But the first Labour ministry would last less than a year before a vote of no confidence forced another election in October of 1924. The vote sprung from the government's refusal to prosecute a communist newspaper for incitement to riot when it called for workers to refuse conscription and, quote, turn their weapons on their oppressors. The election led to a landslide win for the Conservatives, who finished with more than 2/3 of the seats at 412 of a possible 615. Labour went from 191 seats to 151, while the Liberals went from 158 seats to only 40. Shortly after the election, Whitehead wrote a letter to his son North and briefly discussed the election. Quote, "What a crash. In the general election, I mean. I suppose we are now in for 5 years of Conservative government with a slight bias towards the diehards. Anyhow, so long as Curzon is not at the Foreign Office and they do not starve education, the nation will be there after 5 years, all right and ready to go ahead. But badly managed foreign affairs and a badly equipped nation will spell disaster. I do hope that the various progressist sections will end their insane quarrels, mostly personal, and fix on a policy which will achieve something substantial and yet have a chance of getting carried into the next parliament." For what it's worth, in 1929, the Labour and Liberal parties once again combined to win the overall majority of seats, with the Conservatives losing more than 150. I'll end there and say no more on 1920s British politics because I can't take that conversation very far, but perhaps someone else in this group might be able to educate us a little more about it. And so I'll hand it back to Brianne.
Thanks, Joe. I think this kind of personal aspect of Whitehead's political leanings has pretty much escaped me in terms of my approach to Whitehead. It always kind of feels like we're reading Whitehead in a philosophical vacuum. And I think that these papers we've been reading and the background you're giving, they kind of help to remind me that he was writing in a place, in a time that had a history that he was trying to have an influence on. And it's, it seems like a blind spot, I think, in kind of approaching philosophy, in a class without, I guess, in a different country than he was really shaped by. All right, we've got a few questions that I've put to us, and we'll also have a time for a wild card, I think, of just whatever is coming to your mind. But I'll start with our first question. If you turn to the chat, you'll see it there. So from our current moment, Whitehead's concept of, quote, civilization, which is first noted in this address on page 2, which he deploys in numerous works, it can ring with a Eurocentric or a colonial hubris. If there is a civilized, is there an uncivilized? Do you feel that his description of civilization in this text clarifies or complicates the term as you've come to understand it in any productive ways? So I'll put about 3 minutes on the clock for you to think, or if you'd like to type your response into the chat. If you've got a page reference that you want to bring to note, please, you can put that in your question as well. And just hold your typed answers until the end of the 3 minutes, and then we'll all just hit enter at the same time and start to have our conversation. So we've got about 3 minutes for you just to start giving your initial impressions of this question, and I'll see you all in a few. All right. If you find yourself ready to enter your response, please go ahead and we'll just let everyone hit enter as they're ready to. And I'll start by saying something myself that I did find that this essay provided more content to this term civilization than it had prior. And it was good for me to get a sense of maybe what it does and what it doesn't contain. So let's see what all of you are finding. All right, I'm going to start with, you guys can follow in the chat if you want. I'm going to start with Brian, and we'll just kind of move through. And when there's moments to pause and have discussion, we'll do that. Brian says, I've been thinking quite a bit about this. The shortish answer is that he does clearly suffer from some Eurocentric and Victorian views of civilization that are problematic from the perspective of the present. Whitehead should be held accountable for those views. However, I distinguish between the function of the concept I think he means the concept of civilization and the content he gave it. Functionally, civilization means for Whitehead the ultimate aim of progress or the development for humans. Whitehead has a teleological view. I would, quote, save his view of civilization by shifting it and embedding it in his concept of beauty as the ultimate aim of all process. That is, quote, the world is good when it is beautiful, end quote. Let's read a couple more and then we'll just have some conversation time. Miriam says, Whitehead's language on civilization, paradise, progress was a little difficult to read. Such simplistic ideas that I don't typically associate with Whitehead, but perhaps the audience was in mind in the writing. Rudiger says, if I read the first paragraph of Science in the Modern World, I think its concept of civilization is very abstract and definitely not Eurocentric. In the text we discussed today, this is not so clear, but it has a specific auditorium and purpose regarding the elections. Let me just see. Okay, I'm going to do one more and then we'll pause and then we'll come back to the next. Richard says, while I cannot speak for non-European folks, I thought the definition of civilization could just as well apply to the indigenous people of Vancouver Island as it could for Oxbridge Dons. Reasonable comfort and security, allowing the development of ideas and the interpretation of experiences. All right, I'm going to pause there. We've got a few comments here about, I want to just highlight a few things. Brian has said something about holding Whitehead accountable for views and yet trying to view it within a wider teleological framework. Miriam is noting a kind of something that seems at odds with her typical experience of Whitehead's writing in terms of how some of these ideas are presented in a simple way. And Rudiger is saying that maybe there's some kind of a difference in this approach then to how civilization appears in Science in the Modern World. And Richard is saying that this view of civilization could perhaps apply more widely if it is standing in for reasonable comfort and security. So just starting from there, anyone else can jump in. And just a reminder, if you'd like to get into the conversation, there's a couple ways to do it. You can raise your digital hand, which you should have an option to do so at the bottom of your screen. And you can also just raise your actual embodied hand, and there's a few of us enough that we'll be able to see it. Brian, I'll turn it over to you to moderate, and let's just talk for, let's say 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll get into some more responses.
Excellent. So feel free, everybody, to go down to the bottom and your reactions, and you can raise your hand there, or as Brianne suggested, to raise your actual hand. And another reminder, it's always helpful because we are wonderfully spread around. Feel free to introduce yourself briefly, where you're joining us from in particular. So anybody want to start us off? Eric, please, where are you joining us from?
Hi, I'm coming to you from Brookline, Massachusetts, just across the Charles from Whitehead's final home. So I'm going to, well, first I would say that I agree with Rudiger in his reading of this as a different definition of civilization than those found in his philosophical works. I think this is a much more fundamental, primordial definition. But the thing that I really want to do here, and I certainly intend no offense, is to push back a little bit on, I will quote you, Brian, where you say he clearly does suffer from some Eurocentric and Victorian views of civilization that are problematic from the perspective of the present. He should be held accountable for those views. I am not disagreeing with you, but I find it inadequate to simply state that. I think that when we are looking at a historical figure and we say that an opinion differs and that they should be held accountable, then we should take the time to outline what that is, what those differences are, particularly when we're discussing philosophy. I would just, that's all I have to say. And I would appreciate hearing what he should be held accountable for from anyone who believes he should be.
Or even what it would mean to hold, a past philosopher accountable.
That's
and in
correct.
the context of our discussions, cancel culture and its effects in the academy, and there's lots of good stuff going on that makes this a really appropriate conversation. One of the examples that pops into my head is, I teach Aristotle's ethics regularly, and we'll discuss his views on slavery and that some people are natural slaves. And there's a sense in which you hold him accountable to say, he really does say that, he really did believe that. And then for myself, for example, I'll problematize whether or not that's an expression of and a logical requirement of the rest of his philosophy, or whether or not it's maybe in tension with it. I think the latter, that if I take the rest of his works, it seems hard to imagine if someone was just a natural tool, that they wouldn't have a mind, and if they didn't have a mind, they wouldn't be a person. If they were, in which case they're not part of our species. In which case, right? So there's a tension in my mind in this larger framework. I would try to do the same thing with Whitehead, that he makes claims every now and then that make me cringe, and I say, well, it's an expression, but are those moments a product of his what I take as his core philosophical beliefs or intention with them? And so that's the way I usually try and play it out. And so when my comment in the chat in distinguishing between the functional and sort of the function of civilization, it is work, to my mind, frequently functions as sort of an ultimately good thing for him. It's a clearly good thing that we want to move toward. And the examples that he gives sometimes I think are problematic, but the function is trying to play within his thought there. I would use a different term, but I mean, just because the term is so fraught right now, but the function it's trying to play in his work and his thinking, I think is appropriate. He's trying to express this idea of development and progress, and so to my mind, then it's not a fatal problem that I need to sort of therefore throw it out because of its problematic instances. I don't know if that is satisfactory, but that was what I was intending.
Thanks to you both. Who else wants to weigh in? All right, I'm going to return to the chat here for a moment. Let's see, I'm going to start with Michael and then I'll come back to Eric's. Michael says, brought up as a classical scholar, Whitehead would measure civilization by ancient Greece, hence the comparison between slaves and machinery. We're seeing some kinds of resonances here with the reference to Aristotle. Though I do want to point out here that in this text, I think it's on page 4, and I can't remember if that's page 4 of the typed page or of 4 of the overall item. Whitehead says something, we either do it or we get others to do it for us. This was previously done through slavery and it built a civilization on human misery. It does seem to me that there is some kind of resonance or some kind of recognition here that whatever civilization is, that it isn't just a good at all costs. All right, Jeffrey says, I think that this clarifies Whitehead's view on the term civilization. He uses the term as a gentleman of his class in that era would. From what I've read of others from the time, he's as oblivious as many to the Eurocentrism of his position. Joe says, quote, he was struck by this line, and the line is this: it's the possession of these material conditions that I call economic liberty. And it's because we all know this liberty is necessary for civilization that we so often measure civilization in terms of material progress. A good fire on a cold day may not in itself be civilization, but it is a very civilizing agent, end quote. And this prefigures, this is Joe going on, it prefigures something he said in Adventures of Ideas. Quote, the literary exposition of freedom deals mainly with the frills. The Greek myth was more to the point. Prometheus did not bring to mankind freedom of the press. He procured fire, which obediently to human purpose cooks and gives warmth. In fact, freedom of action is a primary human need in modern thought. The expression of this truth has taken the form of, quote, the economic interpretation of history. I'm going to go back to Eric's. If you want to follow me, I'm just scrolling back up to Eric Elder's post. And Eric says, to post slight disagreement with the question, I do find Whitehead's definition of civilization in this essay slightly different than his other works. Or perhaps it's not the definition, but its approach to it, being that it's not a philosophical text, but a political speech. Here he's referring to civilization, not as a collective set of elements or attributes that define a people, no matter how broad the group, but as the primordial condition under which thought and reason can occur, namely humans having their time from the labors necessary for their survival. Yeah, okay, that's really helpful. Humans having time from their labors necessary for their survival. In this, I'm reminded of Mortimer J. Adler's concept of the great idea, which, positive or negative, he takes to be an idea that is impactful on a human level. I think that Whitehead's fundamental view of civilization here can only be a good thing. We've got just 2 more comments, so why don't I just get through them? Matt Seagal, if you want to follow down, I'm about 3 from the bottom. In AI, Whitehead refers to North and South America as, quote, empty continents, end quote, that allowed European peoples to avoid the Malthusian trap. I suppose this was a widespread sentiment in his day, but I cringed when I read it. He also makes a comment in Science in the Modern World about how Native Americans left their environment where they found it, while European settlers made more productive use of it. This is ignorant in the extreme, given what we know about the forestry practices of pre-contact natives. The text we're reading today was surprising to me for its lack of foresight about the potential problems with a close affiliation between science and industry. I think here of the military-industrial complex, big pharma, the oil industry, etc. And Kevin Clark, on page 2 to 3, discussing civilization, Whitehead immediately links it to the physical and or mental aspects. Physical as opposed to ideas and experiences, which surprises me, especially civilization as connected to material conditions and satisfaction and economic liberty. So this word, cringing and canceling, this is very much the time we're in, and I think it's important for us to grapple with these questions. Helpful references to some other texts here, Adventures of Ideas, Science in the Modern World, where we can have some more content added to some of Whitehead's other contents, other concepts of civilization, that is. And of course, here from our present moment, we are dealing with much of the fallout of this kind of mix of science, materialism, and industry. I'm just going to open back up for conversations about any of these cringe-worthy elements, such as they may be.
Maybe I'll ask just a contextual question, and I would ask it to the vectors. This paper, I did not enjoy reading it, and it just seemed to be like he was just whipping off some thoughts on the page really quickly. What is there a tone to these texts that could be considered speeches given to political and or social events? Or is this maybe unique in its tone? So I'm asking just a very broad contextual question.
Joe, do you want to start? You want me to? Or Brian?
I'm not quite sure how to respond. I guess just in the sense of I haven't really seen other papers like this from Whitehead. I don't think we have a lot of his political kind of speeches where he was like stumping for the liberal candidate, which he said or we know from Victor Lowe's biography that he'd done before. So, maybe he just has a completely different tone and those sorts of things that he would have in his philosophical writings that wouldn't be terribly surprising. But yeah, I mean, other than that, I don't know that I can have much to say about it myself.
I think I'm in the similar position as of Joe. I guess I'd add nearly everything we have from him. It was originally orally presented. So almost all of the monograph chapters, certainly not all of them, but were frequently presented in front of an audience, whether it be the Giffords or other specific lectures, or things were presented and then included as a chapter. Joe mentioned one in his opening. There was a presentation that appeared as a chapter in Principles of Relativity. So that was very common for him. This one in particular, being to a political audience, seems to have affected it. I don't doubt that at all. And he didn't choose to include it anywhere else later. So, I'd be hesitant to overinterpret it, but it is sort of unusual. It's an unusual piece, which just makes these things fun because, I didn't enjoy the piece either, but for maybe slightly different reasons. But I mean, but that's a good thing. That's a good thing in some ways, because it means we're being confronted with new materials.
Michael, are you trying to speak? I thought I heard you unmute.
Sorry, no.
Okay.
Lynn, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I just wanted to thank Matt for his comment. I have to say that I found almost everything in this article cringeworthy. The one thing that I found that was actually made me sit up and say, hey, this is the Whitehead that we know and love, is the point where he talks about other utopias. And he said the other utopias are all based on an idea of a static world. The world we are in is constantly changing. And I thought, oh, at last, a kernel. Thank you.
I actually did enjoy reading this, and I'm not, I don't know if I mean, enjoyment, maybe we use it in a more wide ranging way here, but I thought it was, for me, it was just helpful to see some of these. I mean, what is Whitehead so often accused of? Is writing something that seems so abstract that like no one can even read it unless they have, sat with it into a dark room for 7 years and, while they're having, the flights of mystic consciousness. I mean, so it's here we've got something that to me felt like I had to grapple with myself more than I had to grapple with Whitehead. I had to sort of ask myself, well, what do I think about the progress of materialism? And can I have a view on it as a person who was born into a kind of a post-industrial society in which I benefit from and am shackled with all of, and increasingly encountering all of the in front of, behind the scenes, to the side of the scenes costs of that. And I guess as a person who is complicated in my own right, as all of us are, I mean, how many things do we all have that are cringeworthy, right? do we toss ourselves into the river? All right, I've got another question in the box for you all, and I think there's a kind of continuity here, so we'll just put it here for a minute. You can see it in the chat. Whitehead suggests that science has a task of, quote, liberating mankind, page 5. And he calls for his own Labour Party to develop, quote, the vision to use science toward that end. Is Whitehead too naive about the liberating potential of science or the promise of vision? And I think rather than, you can feel free to write your answers out. And Juan, I see that you've also added something here, so we'll come to that in a moment. But why don't we, if you want to type, go ahead. But if I think this question, since it leads from what we just talked about, maybe we can just chat about this. Anyone have any thoughts on this the liberating power of science or the vision to use science toward liberation? Is there a kind of naivete or not? What do you all think?
Eric, please. It's a quiet group today, so
It is. So I'll just throw something out there. First, I would like to, if very briefly, respond to Miriam's question, because I think that there are real distinct differences in the style of this. And I'm not going to dwell on this, but I would just point out the fact that not only is he very repetitive, but he's also rather uncautious with his logic and his logical writing within individual sentences. For instance, on page 14, where he says there is enough truth in a thing so that you can't know that it's all wrong. So I don't think that I don't think that it's horribly completely thought through. But anyway, on this question, I don't particularly believe that he's too naive in the potential of science, but his general position strikes me as very Gene Roddenberryan, and he believes that people.
Eric, what does that mean?
Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, where people, if given the unlimited resources that they need, will themselves pick themselves up by their bootstraps and take it upon themselves to better themselves continuously. And I think through this, basically everyone will become a philosopher within weeks after we solve our energy problems and our production problems. I think that I think he's too naive about the nature of people, quite frankly. And I also think that he's far too naive about the potential of government. And I think that he would do well to listen to his own prophecy about the average muddling Englishman, which I would say applies far beyond the borders of that fine country.
Eric, do you really think naive, or again, writing to an audience?
Well, so the interesting thing here that I think hasn't been mentioned is that someone said stump speech. I think it was Brian. This is not a stump speech. He's challenging. He's saying that his own party is woefully inadequate for the job that he believes they will soon inherit. So I think that he is definitely proposing something that does not currently exist, and something that he thinks can be made a reality by changes within his party, within his political party. And so in that, yes, I would say that he seems naive to me.
So I took up I wonder if others saw a really Baconian sort of vibe going on here, where the sort of getting nature to tell her secrets so that we can bend it to our will to improve the material conditions of humanity. Just an absolute booster for nothing but applied science, as the what we need to do is make more stuff, and of course there's a sense in which we can pull people out of poverty and reduce mortality, and in some ways, in some places we have, but just the spirit within which he's saying we need to do science in order for the sole purpose of production. And it's just to hear him giving this Baconian speech, just, I understand the context coming out of the war. I understand he was enamored with what he saw here, but I would add dangerously naive and problematic. I get that it's for that audience that he was trying to persuade them on a certain course, which is great. It was a moment in time, but yeah, I have trouble with the direction he's headed. It's so unguarded and so problematic that I would judge, if that's what he believed, I think he was wrong. Or I would say within the context of his bigger system, it doesn't fit neatly. Peter.
Peter, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Still new to this. I think in part one has to understand the particular point at which he was saying this, and just in terms of, for instance, the development of economics. Many of his views are very consonant with economists, and he's saying this very early, and so he's pointing to the importance of productivity and growth and things like that, which at that point in time weren't a consistent feature of economies. So he's saying these things long before, well, not long before, but before Keynesian economics, that sort of thing, that made a tremendous difference to our way of understanding economics, things like that. There are differences from that, but he's saying things that are at a point of time. I'm not sure what the relationship between this paper is and the last one that we read, but that one was just on the dawn of the Great Depression. So I think one has to appreciate the circumstances in which he's saying this, as opposed to our current position, which is sort of quite different in many ways.
Thanks for that, Peter. We've got a good comment from Thomas too. Maybe I'll read it if it's okay, Brianne.
Yep.
Given Whitehead's distaste for reductionistic materialism as a viable worldview, it is a little surprising to see his emphasis on, quote, material progress as a measure of improving life, particularly since the, quote, science he wants to, quote, apply to the problem was and still is firmly rooted in that reductionistic materialism. As well, he seems to justify the long ingrained attitude that we need to dominate and exploit nature for all it's worth, damn the consequences. Nevertheless, he is correct in his suggestion that the mentality involved in enjoying civilization needs the support of a healthy physical body. Compare Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But here again, I think the aforementioned milieu is largely to blame for his emphases. Thank you, Thomas.
I'll add just a comment here from Juan, because there's two here from Juan, and one was a little bit above, just to throw this in that hasn't been mentioned yet, that Juan says, this is where I went with the question of civilization in page 1920, when focused on the question of distribution of the material goods for advancing civilizations. Whitehead states that education is the real tool to solve this problem. And Whitehead says, quote, I venture to predict that in the next generation, the United States will give us the first example of a really civilized nation that the world has ever seen, end quote. And then Juan makes another comment here. If we scroll down, given Whitehead's initial and final focus on production and the role of science, it would seem that Whitehead is naive. However, when Whitehead turns toward distribution and the role of higher education, then I'm inclined to say that he is visionary and naive, since we're several generations removed and we seem far from this distribution goal in a truly civilized scientific society.
If I can add really quickly, I was really sure what to say. That's why I waited a long time on the first one. But now on chat, I saw that Lynn just finished writing a book on, to me, what I was trying to fish for something interesting as I was reading this essay. And to me, is when he talks about distribution and points to the United States as possibly the place where this is finally going to happen. Now we are where we are. I mean, the United States, at least I can say, and it seems we're very far. But the really visionary thing or promising thing is this idea that, yes, if we focus, even if we focus on the material goods, and then we worry about the distribution of those material goods in order to provide the grounds for civilization, the real way to do that equitably should be through this higher learning process. And I think that almost a taste saying that the United States is on the way to provide a car for every family, education for every family. And I think we're far from that, even though there's education. I think high quality education is the ones he's probably thinking about. That's where my mind went. It's like, well, it seems like if we're to focus on that, we could take this essay and say, this is where we want children. That's why I want to hear from Lynn next, hopefully. If we want children well educated in our civilized societies with higher learning, with opportunities to do philosophy early, not late or ever, same thing with science or the enjoyment of mathematics, that we need to have a different way to think about how the role of education plays in a highly dynamic society. So that's where my mind went. It still is.
Yeah, but to get back to what Brian was saying about the Baconian element, which I completely agree with you, Brian, and I was like horrified because I don't know if any of you have read Richard Rhodes' The Making of the Atomic Bomb, but you know what the words written in this text directly created, you know, the conditions and the ideas and the positivity around the Manhattan Project. I mean, you know, you've got Fermi making his pile in Chicago, you know, it's like written in this heroic language. And, you know, well, what is the consequence of that? The atomic bomb being dropped twice. So it's the consequences of the language, you know, played out in World War II, and, you know, not in the nice results that you would think would get from the nice ways speaking about the conditions.
Kevin.
Kevin, you're muted.
Yes, thank you.
There you are.
Well, I was can identify both with Lynn, who was shocked about much of this, and with Brianne, who found it somewhat reasonable. But what struck me most is his attitude, like on going from page 4 to page 5, about we must know more about nature and control her to more purpose. And after all, what is science if not a systematic study of nature, which means control of nature, and production is linked to that. And that's all about some kind of power, it seems to me, which I found a little distressing, even though it's about has political application and social, and talks about civilization as well. But that surprised me. I've been studying economic theory now for quite a while. And so we can fault Whitehead, but not fault him for his non-awareness that all of this production sucks raw materials out of ecosystems and creates, you know, a lot of pollution as well as loss of biological diversity now. But even he didn't seem to have any awareness of that aspect of the use of the rest of the natural worlds as just resources for the production of goods for the satisfaction of human wants. And he ends up talking about human wants, I forget, near page 17 or something, quite a bit. So I found that rather surprising and a little distressing. And I'm not sure what to do with it, but I think it's the kernel for me is around that notion on page 4 to 5 about the control of nature and putting nature to use for production towards what might be a sort of neoliberal goal of giving everyone, satisfactory material living conditions. That's it.
Brian, let me turn to the chat and then we'll go to Eric just for a second because I see a couple relevant points. Richard says Whitehead was living in a quote empty world, end quote, as the ecological economists would describe it. And we have to remember that for him, the empty world was ready to be exploited. And in that context, production made sense. Now that we know we live in a quote full world, in fact, more production is not what we need, nor is it sustainable. And the issues of redistribution are top of mind. I cannot consider Whitehead naive at all and find that label unfair. He, like us, are all of a time and place. And on that same point, Lawrence Tolliver adds, Whitehead was doing his best to change the direction of his political party. He was using the rhetoric of his day to underline his intentions. Academia was not the audience for this speech. He did his best to come out of the philosophical clouds and get real with this audience. Back to you, Brian.
Eric, we still on this same trajectory? Feel free.
I just would like to throw out there that I think that there are sort of, there's one big question that I think that we're all sort of crowded around. And that is whether or not, and this is probably not a question we're going to be answering here today, but I think that it's whether or not, we believe that there are general betters. Meaning whether or not we believe, as Whitehead seemed clearly to believe, that humans can make the plight of existence better for themselves. And along those lines, I would bring up, perhaps remind, that science has made things better, at least as much as it's made things worse. I'm old enough to remember the hole in the ozone layer, which has now been basically repaired thanks to science, created by and repaired by. I shudder to think what our environment would be like if we were still using materials the same way we were using materials in Whitehead's day, even when this was written. And so those improvements in science are exactly the sorts of things that Whitehead is going for in linking the hard sciences with applied science. And so while we, as the old theme song says, you take the good, you take the bad. And I think that we're at the end of the day, they're left with that philosophical question of, do we believe that we can make things better, or do we believe perhaps we should just go away? I know that's a stark dichotomy, but I think that it's, comes down to something around there.
I'm enjoying dialoguing with Eric today. If I can jump back in on this, because I had a similar thought. I was just teaching Whitehead recently, and when we were reading through Adventures of Ideas, the word civilization kept jumping out at me. So I decided just to circle it whenever I came across it and try and track it through the book, because it seemed like an interesting, and he does contrast it with savagery at the end of the book. And he, at the end in 274, he actually says that the 5 qualities of civilization are truth, beauty, adventure, art, and peace. So it becomes this all-encompassing sort of presentation of the aim of process. But separate from that, when I was trying to track sort of what separating the cringe from the sort of what I took to be really important, interesting ideas, there was a more of a tension, or not a tension, a contrasting of on the one hand, coordination and persuasion and tolerance and mutual respect and general kindliness. Those are some of his terms, versus slavery, force, power, and coercion on the other. And that civilization was persuasion, and to go to Dan Dombrowski's sort of book, the from force and persuasion sort of contrast as being big for Whitehead. And in that context, I have no objection to it. I think it's actually, again, I today pick a different term because it just is, it's so fraught right now, but that the concepts and the ideas he's trying to explain through that are really important and consistent with what I take to be some of the best aspects of his thought. And that what I would see again as his Baconian theme here, speaking to the Labor Party, and is in tension with that overarching purpose of civilization. The final thought I'd add, just go back to Aristotle, is it reminds me of when Aristotle says we need a certain degree of external goods to achieve eudaimonia. And this essay we could see as like humans need to have their minimum physical conditions met, and that science can help do that, is not too objectionable, right? In fact, it's probably really, really true. And so I would add that as well. Sorry to dominate the floor. Brianne.
Actually, I just wanted to say, I think that Dan Dombrowski is on this call again. And I know that people had raised some issues of force and persuasion last time. So Dan, I don't know if you're there, but if you'd like to weigh in on this, please, we'd love to hear you. And of course, maybe he's doing two things at once.
I've got really bad internet connections.
Dan, there you are. Hi.
So I'm not hiding. I just don't know if you'll be able to hear me or not.
You're coming through loud and clear.
Yeah. I don't have much to add. One thing that I wrote in the margins when I read this piece had to do with the vaccine that a lot of us have gotten in our arms in recent weeks. In other words, I found myself thinking like Whitehead momentarily, at least, thinking that what we really need right now is scientific developments and a conquest for all the problems of that word of this virus. In other words, there a lot of what Whitehead said in this essay was bothersome, but some of it resonated as well. And there were moments during the pandemic where I thought that our best hope is science, and I couldn't imagine anybody else contributing more to the good of mankind humankind than the scientists at Pfizer and Moderna. It's a complex issue, isn't it? I'm just confessing, that some of the experiences I've had recently that led me to think in a Whiteheadian direction, as found in this particular essay. So,
thanks, Dan. Maybe in that same vein, I just wanted to say I was teaching animal ethics and religions this quarter. And I think sometimes when we engage really strong, intractable institutional issues of power, of which there's, depending on your theory of power is everywhere, right? So that we need to speak more about it rather than less about it. But that students sometimes will have this kind of stultifying moment where they think, well, what can we do when we have some intractable institution? Are we just going to go back to everyone just eating a leaf? Are we, and of course, when it comes to a lot of, when we think about industrialization issues, including industrial food production, there's this feeling of like, well, what can we really change it? Can we do it? And I think that there's something really positive about this essay about asking the question of what are the goals that we will be putting innovation toward, right? That innovation can be used for all manner of creativity, some of which can be quite destructive. And I think if there is a kind of sense here that one needs a kind of telos for innovation in order for it to be not productive of destructive forces. Not that he lays it all out here, but when we think about his work in general, that there is a call that innovation for innovation's sake isn't enough, but there needs to be a towardness. that I think is beginning to be gestured toward. All right, shall we? Let's see, we're at 10:07. We've got about 20 minutes here. I'm gonna, let's see, I'll read Rudiger's phrase here, and then we'll go to our next question. Rudiger says that process and reality, in Whitehead is in process reality, always talking about the quote, animal body, end quote, with which we perceive the world. I think this is in line with his emphasizing the material welfare of the body in today's paper. Of course, the sciences are extending our human abilities, and you can call it power. And some other good comments here that I'll let you all read. Let's see. I've got this last question, and I think we've got time for this question or a wild card. So here's, we'll call this question 1. Whitehead presents an idealized view of the United States as a nation leading a, quote, revolution in production that prioritizes the training of scientists and engineers, the funding of laboratories, and 3, connecting that innovation to industry needs. Given the content of this essay, how do you think Whitehead would assess or redress the US's current relation to this aim? And option 2 would just be a wild card. What's on your mind? What did you write in the margins? Or what would you like to bring to the group? So why don't we take about 2 minutes on the clock. You can type out your answer to 1, which is the question here in the chat, or 2, which is a wild card, anything that you would still like to have the group consider. So 2 minutes on the clock. I'll see you all in a couple. All right, as you are ready, go ahead and hit your enter. Let's see what we have, some thoughts here. Oh, it's always a delight to just see these little boxes pop up. Lawrence says that Whitehead might wonder if the USA will survive as a democracy. I'm going to go down to a couple of question ones, and then we'll take a look at the wild card. Miriam says, this quote from Process and Reality gave me a much richer idea of the thoughts than this text. From Process and Reality, page 336, quote, there is greatness in those who build up systems, a greatness in action. in idea, and in self-subordination. Embodied in instance after instance through centuries of growth, there is greatness in the rebels who destroy such systems. The social history of mankind exhibits great organizations in their alternating functions of conditions for progress and of contrivances for stunting humanity. The blessings and curses of schemes of thought, of social agencies for large purposes. The moment of dominance, prayed for, worked for, sacrificed for by generations of the noblest spirits, marks the turning point where the blessing passes into the curse. Some new principle of refreshment is required. The art of progress is to preserve order amid change and to preserve change amid order. I can't help thinking, Miriam, about our first essay, I think it was Humor and Wit, which was very much about order and change. Eric's also taking up question 1. Whitehead's view is certainly idealized, but I think it was less so then than now. That said, I can't begin to suggest that what Whitehead would do if confronted with the 21st century. However, I do think that our time reveals his principal misstep in this speech, namely his belief that human acquisition is determined predominantly by tempered, prudent necessity, and that once those necessities are achieved, the populace will become philosophers en masse. Lynn says, I think this is also to question 1. I think Whitehead would be pleased to see so many interdisciplinary programs addressing issues before us, but dismayed to find how deeply divided by subject discipline the academic world has become. See my comment about his helping to create the or rather undisciplinary Harvard Fellows Program. Juan says, my guess is that Whitehead would applaud the material progress, but would be concerned about the distribution of scientific inquiry and process for the majority. Jeffrey says, if we can forgive Whitehead for the time in which he speaks in regard to science's relation to progress and economic independence, how do we feel about his boosterism of the US as offering the model to which the UK and Europe should aspire? Given Whitehead's awareness of Greek, quote, civilization benefiting from citizens' use of slave labor, isn't he showing us here how blind to the US's material progress from the benefit of African slave labor? I'm going to just keep reading a couple more of question 1 before we go to wild cards. Some really good points here. I imagine that Whitehead would expand his critique in Adventures of Ideas of corporations, as clearly there are many perverse incentives that lead applied science away from human flourishing toward maximal profit extraction. And Peter says Whitehead is attempting to draw distinctions between not just England, but also Europe and the US. The US remains much more dynamic than Europe. I dare say the main change since has been the economic rise of Asia. Before we go to a couple wild cards here, anyone want to weigh in on your colleagues' thoughts? I think I missed Michael Heather's comment, so I'll just read this one. Oh, was that? No, that was a wild card. We'll wait on that for a second. Since I suspect the wild cards might be not unrelated to other thoughts, let's put 2 of them on the table. Brian has given us this wild card. Essays like this are really helpful for me, in part because by revealing Whitehead's political and economic views, they make it easier for me to be clear when my own work is not an expression of Whitehead's thought, but of my own thought, inspired by aspects of Whitehead's thought. In that respect, I found it very helpful. In the end, as a philosopher, I'm less interested in defending what Whitehead believed than advocating for what I think is true. And then Michael also offers us a wild card, one of Whitehead's woolliest. the very vague meanings of science, civilization, and the relevance of politics and the Labor Party, shows he was right usually to keep his normal day job of cosmology. It seems that 1920 to 25 was his wilderness years, when he struggled to move from the formal language of Principia Mathematica and hit the buffers with relativity to the richer, deeper prose style of Process and Reality, although still somewhat obscure. In this piece, Whitehead is exposing his English character by buttering up the Americans while maybe modestly deprecating his own country. Compare the words of Gilbert's Coco, when then the idiot who praises with enthusiastic tone all centuries but this, and every country but his own. So yeah, what final, anyone want to weigh in here on the kind of, Brian has given us this point of like, almost what is the task of philosophy? What can we expect from Whitehead, and where does our own work have to kick in? I think, Eric, you've kind of gestured to this as well, like, you know, kind of what is the task of philosophy, not just in Whitehead's time, but in our own. And maybe part of the task, as Michael has raised, is to be able to sort of take some elements and leave some. I'd love to hear from some of you.
Miriam, please.
I love Michael saying Whitehead should keep to his normal day job of cosmology, and realizing that I obviously had personal reactions to this essay rather than philosophical ones. It makes me think that, yeah, I guess I don't know what to say about that, but how can one be so philosophical in one piece and so non-philosophical in the other? And I guess it challenges me to think of what I am supposed to get out of this paper is maybe. And I really think that Whitehead shouldn't have given this talk and instead should have stuck to his job as cosmology.
In a way, I wonder if Whitehead wouldn't agree with Michael. I wonder if he wouldn't have said, you know, he's usually pretty like, yeah, actually, I'm kind of just not, this is not my expertise. I'm kind of, he even hints at it at the beginning, right? I'm not sure he would necessarily disagree with Michael's characterization. He's doing it anyway, and but yeah, I think he'd be pretty clear that this is not his strong, not where he's most learned, and it's still interesting. But Lawrence, please.
It also goes to a point that was just made about disciplinarity, that Whitehead sometimes does say, you know, I'm going to try to venture across this line and not just stay in a lane. And I think that that's you know, it's something that we have to ask, I think, what is the role of philosophy in society if we only stay in a very narrow lane? And sorry,
That's fair.
Lawrence, to you.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, Lawrence, we haven't heard from you. Please jump in.
You're muted,
Still
Lawrence.
muted, sorry.
I'm going to basically be repeating what Brianne just said, namely that every philosopher ought to face the challenge of going to a political party and communicating from his or her heart what you want that party to do. Just give it a try and see if you don't leave 90% of your highfalutin ideas behind.
Do you have a personal story to share, Lawrence? I would love to hear of an attempt to do this.
Well, my personal story is too old to be relevant, somewhat like what we just got finished reading. No, it is good to have great intelligence, but when it comes to talking to everyday people in a political party, particularly a labor party, it's not going to do you any good.
Joe, please.
I do want to just briefly raise one point which occurred to me, because I agree on the one hand with both sides of, on the one hand, stick to your day job, and on the other, try and say something practical to a general audience. But it occurred to me as we were talking about this that it's interesting that this paper was saved, right? Because it's not like we got a lot of these papers that hadn't been published, and this one, someone, either Whitehead or someone in his family, thought this was important and preserved it, and now we have it. And you know, it's not, I don't have an answer. It's not clear to me why this was saved over other ones. Presumably he gave other talks like this at other times. But I don't know, did he mean maybe to publish this at some point? He never did, but we know that he planned books that never made it out. So I don't know, just a thought to throw out there at the end here.
Yeah, Juan. And then Lynn.
Yeah, just following from what Lawrence was telling us, I do feel that there was something insightful here, at least for me. That's why I mentioned personally and generally that when he was talking about production wasn't that necessarily interesting, but when he talked about distribution, I thought was quite powerful, because he said, right, most of you would disagree with this part, because for you, distribution of this of the means of production is more like maybe Marxist view or others. And he was really, he doesn't quite tell us clearly what he means, but he is really contemplating the possibilities. And I think that that's where I was drawn into the typical Whitehead, very optimistic Whitehead. You know, there's an opportunity for us here to do something. And I think he says the United States will get this, because look, they're on the way, all these universities, everybody's going to be educated, there's a true civilization. So I come back to the passage I pointed out, because I felt that if we were to now, I mean, talking about vaccines just really quickly, well, I think we've got the scientific development of the vaccines and possibly the distribution, right? At least for the United States, maybe not the rest of the world. But then we have the problem of having people convinced that this is worth taking, you know? So the problem is the distribution insofar as how do we get folks philosophically engaged in the scientific progress, in this act of being in a civilized society, knowing that there's connotations, right? So I just think that to me is where this essay has worth and relevance today. So I just wanted to maybe re-emphasize that, I guess.
Thanks, Juan. Lynn, did you still want to jump in? We've got about 5 minutes left.
Sure, just a quick, I wanted to respond to your comment, Brian, about realizing it's your own philosophy you're thinking about. And I agreed, when I started my study of Whitehead, I was asking the question, where would Whitehead have taken his philosophy if he lived today, in the days of what we know about quantum mechanics and cosmology? But then as I read further, I realized I was really asking my own question, where should we take philosophy today, and where do I take my philosophy? So I thank you for your comment, Brian.
Absolutely. Peter, and then Eric.
Yep. I just, something that struck me was that Whitehead is ambivalent to many things, and yet he does, in the papers certainly that what we've read, he hasn't really been very ambivalent to politics, and yet he seems to have been left without a political party that he had, consisting of people who he thought were going to agree with him, for instance. It just strikes me as quite odd that he does have this very positive conception of democracy, for instance, and political institutions, whereas the political party which he associated with, I think earlier he said, was exterminated, wasn't he? So didn't he? So I was just, I found that quite striking, that he does have this optimism in the light of that.
Thanks, Peter. Eric, we've got a good 3 minutes, so we're really getting to go just as we get up ahead of steam, and then we're then we're just out of time. But Eric, what are you thinking?
I don't know how much this is going to contribute, but reflecting on that question of what Whitehead would be thinking or doing today, I'm thinking that, just positioning this essay back in 1923, I have a strong suspicion that his view of the United States would have been different in 1929. But then I think that, again, his vision of America, probably, he died in 47, right? If he had actually lived to see the post-war years in the United States, I have to imagine that he would have been as happy as a clam. Now, granted, I don't think that he would be so blind as to not see the often hidden inequalities within American society. But any society that is producing his books in mass paperbacks, I think that he would probably think that that's probably a place on the right path.
He did naturalize, and he did seem to genuinely like America, and I think he liked that it was less, I don't know if you say caste-based. It was less. He thought it was more dynamic. I think he had a positive view of its dynamism. Peter.
Well, just in our last reading, he certainly recognized the plutocratic side of American politics. So he certainly wasn't unaware of the distributional issues in the US, I don't think.
It really does seem like he could have been just going back and trying to get them to fund a bunch of science. Like, he was like, look at the Americans. You guys are falling behind. Come on. I just saw so much great stuff. Fund the universities. Because he's also, Joe, remind me, he's right then he's still at Imperial College as a administrator, right? So he's an administrator at Imperial College, which compares to MIT. He's just like, dude, we need a bigger budget. Like, that's really all he's that's all he's just trying to position his school for more money. Okay, we solved it. All right, we're good. Sorry, flippant and ending there. Brianne, did you have any final concluding thoughts?
No, I wanted to say that I think maybe to a couple points and to Lawrence's as well, that on page 22, Whitehead says the quote, "Science is very rarely mentioned in political circles, and I've never once heard it hinted at that this science is capable of revolutionizing our whole national well-being in one generation." In a sense, I think he seems to be calling out politics for its kind of limitations, that it needs to also, in as much as Lawrence has helpfully reminded us that it's like, what would it mean for academics to kind of go into various political spheres and have to translate thoughts there? It's like he's also calling politics at that moment to kind of get out and to see what's happening. What innovation is there? How can politics become part of the world that is yet to come? So, I don't know, I guess I just want to say thanks, everyone. Thanks, Brian, thanks, Joe, and thanks everyone here and not here, present and virtual, who has been joining us on this journey. It's been such a fun experiment. It's been such a delight to just kind of be exposed to these pieces that are sometimes related and sometimes so different than the works that we have on our bookshelves. And it's really been just a great medicine, I think, coming out of this pandemic, to have this virtual community. And speaking of science and its possibilities, we certainly are indebted to it to be able to be together from around the world in this virtual space. Brian or Joe, any thoughts you'd like to add?
I would just quickly, a couple of points. One, if you haven't already, you might make sure to subscribe to the research blog. Go to whiteheadresearch.org and go to any page, I think, on the right-hand side, and you can just put in your name and email address, and you'll get our updates that are at least quarterly, so you can keep tabs on the progress of the critical edition. Joe mentions that we, and I think Brianne has in the past, we very well may reboot in the fall we're sort of going to regroup and see what's there and what our capacity is, but this was successful enough that it seems likely that we want to try and see if there's a version of continuing this. And so final thought, if you go to the Whitehead Research Project website and go to the critical edition, it also keeps a running list of just where we are in the project, what we're editing, what the next volume is, things like that. So at any time you can go there. Reach out to myself or Joe about the edition at any time. And please read the second volume of the Harvard Lectures this summer, so you can think about proposing a paper topic for our conference next summer.
And to that point, if anyone has any burning ideas of something that we'd like to see taken up, you can certainly send an email to Joe, Brian, and I, and we can think about any ideas, kind of put them in the mix of our marinations as we go forward. I've been seeing all these thanks and coming through the chat. So Brian and Joe, make sure you maybe save the chat there and just take a look. Yeah, ditto to all of you. Received
Maynard
and returned.
got his hand up. So Maynard, did you want to make a comment?
Just a question to Joe for maybe in the fall. Well, is there any correspondence between Whitehead and John Dewey on issues like this? Any extant material that would be relevant? So
there's only one letter.
Just
there's only one letter that I know of in our archive between Whitehead and Dewey, and it's Dewey thanking Whitehead for reviewing one of his books, and I forget which one it is. And he says that, oh, I really should have credited you more in experience in nature because I learned a lot from you. And that letter is up on our archive. You can find it. Just go to the WRL and search for John Dewey. But other than that, sadly, that's the only thing we have, I believe.
Okay.
In terms of letters, what we also have, Maynard, you probably know about is the APA symposium that Dewey and Whitehead did, where they responded to each other's work, and so that's probably the most fertile material in direct engagement between the two of them as philosophers.
Also, Whitehead discusses Dewey in volume 2. In his seminar, he talks about Dewey.
That's a good point, right? He assigned Dewey's work,
yeah.
And yes, and you'll find regular references. So if you go to the indices are. That's right. The indices are excellent in those lectures. And so if you go to the index and look at any philosopher you're interested in, it's a very good detailed index.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
the recording
so
of this will be up on the website. And thanks to Brianne for this amazing idea. Woohoo!
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much. Take good care until next.